The moment my father signed his name at the bottom of those papers, my entire life was erased with one stroke of a pen. I was sitting across the table from him, watching his hand move steadily, deliberately, while my sister sat beside him, pretending not to smile. There was no shouting, no dramatic argument, no warning, just ink soaking into paper, sealing away the family assets, the company I had helped build, and my identity along with it. When he slid the folder across the table toward my sister and said, "It's done," something inside me went completely still. Not broken, not angry, just silent. They thought that silence meant defeat. They thought I had nothing left to fight with. They believed that by the time I walked out of that room, I was broke, powerless, and finished. What none of them understood was that the moment they thought they had won was the exact moment their collapse became inevitable. Because everything they thought they took from me was only the surface. And within 24 hours, every assumption they made about power, loyalty, and control would unravel in ways they could never have imagined. I didn't cry when I stood up from the table. I didn't argue. I didn't even ask why. I simply closed my folder, thanked my father for his time, nodded once at my sister, and walked out of the conference room like someone who had just finished a routine meeting. My heels echoed down the hallway of the building that still carried my fingerprints in every system, every protocol, every safeguard. The irony was almost unbearable. I had designed half of what kept that company running, yet in their minds, I had just been reduced to nothing. Outside, the late afternoon sun felt too bright, too ordinary for what had just happened. Cars passed, people laughed on the sidewalk. Life continued, unaware that my father had just chosen one daughter over another and called it fairness. I sat in my car for a long moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing slowly. I felt the familiar ache of family betrayal, something I had lived with my entire life, but this time it was different. This time I wasn't scrambling to survive it. I was observing it. Growing up, favoritism had been woven into the fabric of our household so seamlessly that questioning it felt like questioning gravity. My sister had always been the chosen one, the golden child, the one whose mistakes were excused as passion, whose demands were framed as ambition. I was the dependable one, the quiet one, the one expected to carry responsibility without recognition. When our mother died, that imbalance hardened into something crueler. I stepped in where my father withdrew. I managed schedules, handled suppliers, soothed employees, and eventually took on an executive role in the family business, not because anyone asked me to, but because someone had to. For years I told myself it didn't matter who got the praise as long as the company survived. I believed loyalty would eventually be returned. I believed family meant something beyond convenience. I was wrong. The papers my father signed that afternoon transferred ownership of nearly every tangible asset to my sister. Properties, accounts, voting shares, the company itself. On paper, she now controlled everything. On paper, I had been excluded, erased, left completely broke. And on paper, that was exactly how they wanted it to look. When I arrived home that evening, my phone buzzed nonstop. Messages from coworkers who had already heard rumors. A brief text from my sister that simply read, "No hard feelings, this is just business." And one voicemail from my father, curt and rehearsed, telling me he hoped I would understand, and that this decision was for the good of the family. I didn't respond to any of it. Silence had always been my survival skill. This time, it was my strategy. I poured a glass of water and sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had spent countless late nights reviewing contracts and projections for a company that no longer wanted my name attached to it. The hurt came in waves, sharp and familiar. But beneath it was something steadier. Clarity. They believed they had stripped me of everything that mattered. They believed money and titles were the sum total of power. They had no idea how wrong they were. What my father didn't remember, or perhaps never fully understood, was that years earlier, when the company faced its first major expansion, it was me who had insisted on restructuring the corporate framework. I was the one who pushed for layered governance, compliance triggers, and protective clauses that would activate under specific conditions. At the time, he had waved it off, trusting me blindly, happy to let me handle the details while he focused on appearances. My sister hadn't even attended those meetings. She had been too busy enjoying the lifestyle the business provided. Those systems were still there, quiet, waiting. That night, as the city outside my window settled into darkness, I opened my laptop for the first time since leaving that conference room. I didn't rush. I didn't panic. I logged in with credentials they had never thought to revoke because they never imagined I would need them again. I reviewed dashboards, compliance logs, and partnership agreements, not to act yet, but to confirm what I already knew. Everything they thought they owned sat on a foundation they didn't control. I closed the laptop without making a single change. Sleep came slowly. Memories kept surfacing. Childhood dinners where my sister's voice dominated the room while mine faded into the background. Board meetings where my proposals were acknowledged only when repeated by someone else. Moments where my father's approval hovered just out of reach, always conditional, always shifting. I realized then that this betrayal wasn't sudden. It was simply the most honest expression of who they had always been. The next morning I woke before my alarm, the kind of wakefulness that comes not from anxiety but from resolve. I brewed coffee and stood by the window, watching the city wake up. Somewhere across town my sister was probably celebrating her victory, already planning how to reshape the company in her image. Somewhere else my father was likely reassuring himself that he had done the right thing, that I would eventually accept my place. Neither of them knew that the clock had already started ticking. By mid-morning, messages began circulating internally. Finance teams flagged minor delays. A routine transaction stalled under compliance review. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming enough to prompt immediate concern, but enough to create discomfort. I heard about it through people who still trusted me, people who knew who had truly kept things running. They didn't know why it was happening. I did. I remained invisible. I didn't go to the office. I didn't call anyone. I let the system do exactly what it was designed to do when governance was breached and fiduciary responsibilities were ignored. What they had triggered wasn't a single event. It was a chain reaction. In the early afternoon, my sister called me for the first time since the signing. Her voice was sharp, irritated. She asked if I knew why certain accounts were acting strange. I told her calmly that I no longer worked there and suggested she speak to legal. There was a pause on the line, the first crack in her confidence. She hung up without saying goodbye. I smiled, just slightly. This wasn't revenge fueled by rage. This was consequence. They had believed manipulation would secure loyalty. They had mistaken my patience for weakness, my silence for surrender. They thought excluding me would simplify their lives. Instead, they had exposed how fragile their control really was. As evening approached, I sat alone again at my kitchen table, phone face down, untouched. Outside, the city lights flickered on, one by one. I thought about how easily power shifts when people underestimate the quiet ones, how often women like me are dismissed until the moment everything stops working without us. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. They had taken my name off the door. They had taken my shares. They had taken the illusion of belonging I had clung to for far too long. What they hadn't taken was my understanding of the system they now stood inside, blind and exposed. And this was only the beginning. By the time my sister realized that ownership on paper didn't equal control, by the time my father understood what he had truly signed away, it would already be too late. The collapse wouldn't be loud. There would be no single moment to point to, no villain to blame, just a steady unraveling that could not be reversed. I turned off the lights and went to bed knowing that while they slept, believing they had won, the foundation beneath them was already shifting. And tomorrow, the cracks would begin to show. The first call came at 8:12 the next morning, and I let it ring until it stopped. Then another followed, and another. By 9 o'clock, my phone felt heavier just sitting on the table, vibrating with urgency that no longer belonged to me. I didn't answer because I already knew what they were feeling. Confusion first, then irritation. And finally, the creeping sense that something fundamental was slipping out of their hands. At the company headquarters, the mood shifted subtly but unmistakably. It wasn't panic yet. Panic is loud. This was quieter. Tense whispers near the elevators. Finance staff rechecking numbers they had reviewed twice already. A delay in vendor payments that normally cleared without question. Someone joked about a system glitch, but the laughter didn't quite land. My sister arrived late, sunglasses still perched on her head, confidence carried like armor. She walked through the lobby as if she owned the place now because technically she did. People smiled at her out of habit, not loyalty. That distinction mattered more than she realized. In the executive conference room, she dropped her bag on the table and demanded updates. Why were payments stalled? Why was the compliance team suddenly requesting documentation that had never been required before? Why had a routine loan extension been flagged for review? The answers were vague, procedural, frustratingly non-committal. No one could point to a single problem, which made it impossible to fix. My father arrived shortly after, moving slower than usual. He had slept poorly. I could see it in the way he rubbed his temples, the way his gaze lingered on the glass walls as if expecting clarity to appear there. He listened while department heads spoke, nodding, asking questions that revealed more uncertainty than authority. "This doesn't make sense," he finally said. "We've never had issues like this." No one responded. They all knew the truth but didn't yet know how to say it. From my kitchen table, miles away and entirely uninvolved on paper, I watched the data flow in real time. The systems were behaving exactly as designed. When governance structures changed abruptly without full board verification, safeguards activated. When fiduciary oversight shifted to a single untested authority, risk protocols triggered. Nothing was frozen outright. That would have caused immediate alarm. Instead, everything slowed. Just enough to create pressure. Just enough to force scrutiny. I took a sip of coffee and closed the dashboard again. This was the part no one ever sees. Revenge fantasies focus on confrontation, on dramatic exposure. But real consequences unfold in silence, buried in clauses no one bothered to read because they trusted the wrong people to explain them later. My sister didn't attend those meetings years ago. She didn't sit beside me when I argued for layered approval processes. She didn't roll her eyes when my father complained that I was making things too complicated. She certainly didn't remember signing off on structures that gave operational independence to committees she never paid attention to. By noon, the first external call came in. A longtime partner requested clarification on the recent ownership change. They wanted assurances about continuity and oversight. My sister reassured them with practiced charm, promising everything was under control. She didn't realize the question itself was a warning. When the call ended, she slammed her hand on the table. "Why does everyone suddenly need reassurance?" she snapped. "Nothing has changed." But everything had changed. Across town, I met with an old colleague for lunch. Someone who had left the company years earlier after being sidelined much the same way I had been. We talked about neutral things at first, weather, traffic, mutual acquaintances. Then she looked at me and said quietly, "They finally did it, didn't they?" I nodded. She didn't ask for details. She didn't need them. People like us recognize the pattern immediately, the betrayal, the assumption that competence equals compliance. "They're already struggling," she said after a pause. "I heard finance is a mess." I smiled faintly. "It's not a mess," I said. "It's a mirror." Back at headquarters, my father pulled my sister aside. His voice was low, urgent. He asked if she had spoken to me. She scoffed and said there was no reason to. That I was out, that I had no leverage, that whatever was happening was a temporary inconvenience. He wanted to believe her. He needed to believe her. Because acknowledging otherwise meant facing the possibility that he had underestimated the one child he had always taken for granted. The afternoon brought more questions. A bank requested updated compliance confirmations. An auditor flagged an inconsistency in reporting authority. Legal advised caution before signing anything new. Each request was reasonable, each delay defensible. Together they formed a tightening circle. My sister called again, this time leaving a voicemail. Her tone was sharper, irritation edging toward panic. She asked if I had done something. I deleted the message without listening to the end. By evening, my father sat alone in his office, staring at the framed photo of the three of us taken years ago at a company anniversary dinner. I remembered that night, how he had thanked my sister publicly for her vision while I stood beside them, unmentioned, invisible. The memory didn't hurt anymore. It clarified. He picked up his phone and hovered over my contact name. Put it down. Picked it up again. Pride and fear waged a quiet war inside him. Meanwhile, my sister paced her living room, heels discarded, wine glass untouched. She scrolled through emails, trying to find something solid to grab onto. Everything felt slippery now. People were polite but distant, helpful but cautious. The loyalty she assumed came with ownership was nowhere to be found. She didn't know it yet, but she had crossed an invisible threshold, the point where people stop trusting your authority and start protecting themselves from it. That night, I slept soundly. The next morning, the situation escalated without anyone pulling a single obvious lever. A major supplier requested revised terms pending internal review. A scheduled expansion meeting was postponed. The company's internal chat buzzed with speculation, quickly shut down by HR reminders about professionalism. My sister arrived earlier this time, determined to project control. She wore a tailored suit, her hair flawless, her voice clipped and commanding. But confidence without substance is brittle. It cracks under pressure. During a closed-door meeting, legal finally said the words she didn't want to hear. There may be an issue with how the transfer was executed, they admitted. Not illegal, but incomplete. Incomplete. That single word sucked the air from the room. My father felt it too. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing as he replayed the signing in his mind. How quickly it had happened. How little he had questioned. How eager he had been to believe this would solve everything. For the first time, doubt crept in. He didn't call me yet, but my name hovered in the room like a ghost neither of them could ignore. From my side of the city, I watched the ripple spread. Partners hesitating, advisors urging caution, systems doing exactly what they were meant to do when control changed hands without understanding. This wasn't about punishment, it was about exposure, the kind that reveals who actually holds things together when titles mean nothing. By late afternoon, my sister's confidence had fully eroded. She snapped at assistants, blamed advisors, accused teams of incompetence. Each outburst isolated her further. My father finally called me just before sunset. I let it ring once, twice. Then I answered. His voice was strained, carefully neutral. He asked how I was. I told him I was fine. He asked if I had noticed any unusual activity at the company. I said I no longer worked there and suggested he speak with his legal team. There was a pause, heavy, loaded. "We may need to talk," he said quietly. "About what?" I asked. He hesitated. "About everything." I looked out my window as the city darkened, lights flickering on one by one. "I don't think there's anything left to discuss," I replied. He didn't argue. He couldn't. The silence between us stretched, unfamiliar and uncomfortable. Then he hung up. As night settled in, I closed my laptop again without touching a single control. Everything was already in motion. The safeguards, the questions, the doubt. They believed power was something you could transfer with a signature. They were learning, too late, that control is something you earn, something you understand, something you don't notice until it's gone. I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, knowing that tomorrow would be louder. Not because I would speak, but because the systems they ignored would continue to answer for me. By the third morning, the tension had thickened into something everyone could feel, but no one wanted to name. It clung to the air inside the company like humidity before a storm, heavy and oppressive, making every conversation feel strained and every decision feel dangerous. The illusion that this was a temporary glitch had already begun to crack. My sister stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new office, staring down at the city as if dominance alone could restore order. The chair behind her desk was still unfamiliar, the leather unbroken, the space not yet molded to her presence. She had wanted this office for years. Now that she had it, it felt colder than she imagined. "Why is nothing moving?" she demanded without turning around. The head of finance shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had worked under me for years, had trusted my judgment even when he didn't fully understand the framework behind it. Speaking to her now felt like navigating a minefield. "Funds aren't frozen," he said carefully. "They're delayed, pending review." "Review of what?" she snapped. "Governance alignment," he replied. "Risk exposure, authority verification." She spun around, disbelief flashing across her face. "I own the company. What authority do they need beyond that?" No one answered immediately, not because they didn't know, but because the truth was complicated, and complicated truths rarely go over well with people who expect simple obedience. In another part of the building, my father sat through a meeting with legal advisors, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He had never liked these conversations. Too many words, too many caveats, too many reminders that signing something didn't always mean understanding it. "There are mechanisms in place," one of the lawyers explained, flipping through a thick binder. "They were implemented years ago to protect the company from unilateral decisions." My father frowned. "By whom?" The lawyer hesitated for just a second too long. "By your former chief operations lead." He knew exactly who that was. My name wasn't spoken, but it hung there, unmistakable. A memory surfaced uninvited. Years earlier, sitting at the same long table, arguing for layered oversight after watching another family business implode from unchecked authority. My father had been distracted that day, scrolling through his phone, trusting me to handle it. He had trusted me because I was dependable, because I didn't demand credit, because I didn't make noise. He trusted me enough to forget me. By midday, the first rumor slipped beyond the company walls. A business columnist tweeted a vague observation about internal instability at a once solid family enterprise. No names, no accusations, just enough to spark curiosity. My sister saw it within minutes. "Who's talking to the press?" she shouted, storming out of her office. "I want names." No one answered. Fear had begun to replace loyalty, and fear makes people quiet. From my apartment, I watched the story unfold through channels that had nothing to do with gossip, market indicators, partner communications. The subtle shift in tone when professionals stop assuming stability and start preparing for fallout. I had spent years learning to read those signals. They were speaking loudly now. I didn't intervene. I didn't need to. What my sister didn't understand was that control isn't about visibility. It's about influence. About being embedded so deeply into a system that your absence becomes impossible to ignore. She had inherited a structure she didn't know how to read. In the early afternoon, she called an emergency meeting with senior leadership. Her voice was tight, her posture rigid, confidence forced rather than assumed. "We are not in crisis," she declared. "We are transitioning, and transitions come with resistance." A few heads nodded. Most stayed still. One executive cleared his throat. "With respect, the concern isn't resistance, it's uncertainty. Partners are asking who has final approval authority for certain decisions." "I do," she said sharply. "Legally, yes," he replied. "Operationally, it's more nuanced." She stared at him, anger flaring. "Are you questioning my authority?" "I'm questioning the framework," he said calmly. "The one that's been in place for years." Years. The word landed harder than she expected. That framework had my fingerprints all over it. While she fought battles she didn't understand, I spent the afternoon revisiting old emails. not to dwell, but to remind myself how thoroughly I had been erased long before that signing ceremony. Messages where my warnings were acknowledged and ignored. Reports where my name was removed before presentation. Decisions credited to others that originated in my late-night analyses. This wasn't just about assets or control. It was about recognition. About what happens when competence is treated as a resource rather than a person. By late afternoon, my father's composure had begun to fray. He sat alone in his office, door closed, staring at the transfer documents again. The signatures were clear, the intent unmistakable, and yet the reality refused to align with what he had expected. He replayed the conversation with me the night before. My calm voice, my refusal to engage, the way I had declined his offer to talk without hesitation. For the first time, he felt something dangerously close to fear. Not fear of losing the company. Fear of losing the narrative he had built in his own mind. The story where he was a fair father, where his decisions were justified, where my silence meant agreement. My sister felt it too, though she would never admit it. She scrolled through her contacts, calling in favors, leaning on connections she believed were loyal to her. Each conversation ended the same way. Polite concern, vague reassurances, no commitments. Power, she was learning, doesn't transfer as cleanly as property. As evening approached, the compliance department issued a formal notice. Routine, procedural, but firm. Certain approvals would require additional verification until governance questions were resolved. It wasn't a shutdown. It was worse. It was a pause with conditions. My sister read the notice 3 times, her hands trembling slightly. She called legal again, demanding explanations they could no longer soften. My father watched her from across the room, seeing her not as the confident successor he had envisioned, but as someone drowning in complexity she didn't know how to navigate. He thought of me then, unbidden, of how I had handled crises without theatrics, how things had simply worked. The comparison stung. That night, I received a message from an old board member who had quietly stepped down months earlier. He didn't ask questions. He simply wrote, "I see what's happening. You always knew this day might come." I replied with one sentence, "I prepared for it." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. By the end of the 3rd day, the atmosphere inside the company had changed completely. Conversations were hushed. Decisions deferred. The confidence my sister had worn so easily was gone, replaced by visible strain. My father looked older, smaller somehow, burdened by the weight of a choice he could no longer undo. And still, I remained absent. That absence was doing more damage than any confrontation ever could. As I turned off my lights and prepared for bed, I thought about how often women are taught that silence is weakness, that if we don't fight loudly, we lose. But silence, when chosen deliberately, can be devastating. It forces others to confront their own mistakes without distraction. They believed I had been left with nothing. What they hadn't realized was that I had walked away with the one thing they could never take from me: understanding. And by the time they grasped what that meant, the ground beneath them was already shifting beyond repair. The 4th day began with a meeting my sister hadn't planned for, and my father hadn't been invited to. That alone should have told them how far control had already slipped, but denial has a way of blinding people long past the point of reason. The request came from the Compliance Committee, one of those quiet internal bodies most executives forget exists until it starts asking questions. It wasn't framed as an accusation. It was worse than that. It was framed as routine. A neutral request for clarification regarding governance continuity following a sudden transfer of ownership. Language so calm, so clinical, it made my sister's skin crawl. She read the email twice, then a 3rd time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less threatening. They didn't. The meeting was scheduled for that afternoon. Mandatory attendance, no proxies allowed. At headquarters, the tension had shifted again, no longer confused, no longer irritated. Now it was wary. Employees moved more carefully, conversations cut short the moment someone senior walked by. The building itself felt like it was holding its breath. My sister sat at her desk, tapping her nails against the polished surface, rehearsing answers in her head. She told herself this was procedural, that it would pass. That ownership meant authority, and authority meant immunity. She had grown up watching my father glide through crises on reputation alone. She expected the same protection. What she didn't understand was that the system had never been designed to protect personalities. It had been designed to protect the company from them. In a smaller conference room on the 17th floor, the compliance committee assembled. No fanfare, no raised voices, just binders, tablets, and quiet professionalism. My sister walked in with a practiced smile that faded the moment she realized there were no friendly faces waiting for her. The chairwoman nodded politely and gestured for her to sit. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," she said. "We'll keep this efficient." Efficient was not the word my sister would have chosen. They began with simple questions. When was the transfer executed? Who reviewed it? Which safeguards were consulted prior to finalization? My sister answered confidently at first, repeating phrases she had heard my father use for years. Standard procedure, legal oversight, executive discretion. Then the questions narrowed. Had the operational authority matrix been updated? Had risk committees been notified? Had the fiduciary alignment clause been reviewed in light of the ownership concentration? Her answers grew slower, less certain. "I was told everything was handled," she said finally, irritation creeping in. "Are you suggesting it wasn't?" The chairwoman didn't react. "We're suggesting that several protocols were bypassed," she replied calmly. "Protocols that exist for a reason." Across town, my father received a separate email, a request for documentation. His stomach tightened as he read it. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had expected some resistance, some adjustment period. He had not expected to be questioned like this. He called his lawyer, voice low and urgent. The reassurance he received was thin, conditional. "It's not a violation," the lawyer said carefully, "but it may be problematic." Problematic was a word my father hated. It implied consequences without clarity. From my apartment, I followed none of it directly. I didn't need to. The patterns were predictable. The moment oversight bodies wake up, the narrative shifts. What was once framed as family business becomes governance risk. Personal decisions become liabilities. That was the point of the structure I had insisted on years earlier. To make sure no single person, no matter how powerful they thought they were, could gamble with something so many people depended on. My sister emerged from the meeting pale and furious. She slammed her office door hard enough to rattle the glass walls. She called legal again, her voice sharp, demanding answers they could no longer soften. "They're acting like I did something wrong," she snapped. "This is harassment." "It's oversight," the lawyer replied cautiously, "and it's within their mandate." "Fix it," she said. "That's what I pay you for." But there were no fixes for this, only processes, slow, unforgiving processes. By early afternoon, word had spread through the building that compliance was involved. That single fact changed everything. Executives who had been hesitant now became guarded. Managers delayed decisions, citing review requirements. Everyone started documenting everything. When oversight enters the room, loyalty leaves it. My father arrived unannounced, his presence usually enough to command attention. Today it barely registered. People nodded respectfully and went back to their conversations. He noticed. It unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. He pulled my sister aside, his voice strained. "What did they say?" She waved him off, pacing. "They're overreacting. This is just bureaucracy." But her eyes betrayed her. She was scared. That fear deepened when an external auditor requested a preliminary review. Not an investigation. Not yet, just a review. The kind that precedes much worse things. My father sat down heavily in a chair, suddenly exhausted. He thought back to the day he signed the papers. How decisive it had felt. How final. He had believed he was restoring balance, correcting what he saw as years of tension between his daughters. Now, that balance felt like an illusion he had shattered. For the first time, he wondered what I had known that he hadn't bothered to ask. That evening, a senior partner requested a private call with my sister. She took it eagerly, hoping for reassurance. Instead, she was met with careful distance. The partner expressed concern about stability, about leadership continuity, about reputational risk. "I assure you everything is fine," she said, forcing confidence. "I hope so," the partner replied, "because if it isn't, we'll have to reconsider our exposure." When the call ended, she stared at her phone, hands trembling. Exposure. Risk. Words she had never associated with herself before. I spent that evening walking through my neighborhood, letting the cool air settle my thoughts. People passed me, unaware of the quiet implosion unfolding behind closed doors. I felt no rush of satisfaction, no glee, just a steady sense of inevitability. This was what happened when betrayal met structure, when manipulation collided with accountability. Back at headquarters, my father sat alone in his office long after everyone else had left. He pulled out an old notebook, one I had once used during strategy sessions. Flipping through it, he saw my handwriting. Diagrams, notes about risk mitigation, warnings scribbled in the margins. For the first time, he read them carefully. The realization settled slowly, heavily. I hadn't just worked for that company, I had protected it, and he had handed it to someone who had never understood what protection required. That night, my sister called me again. This time, she didn't leave a voicemail. She hung up after the second ring, pride warring with desperation. I saw the missed call and did nothing. Silence, once again, did the work for me. By the end of the fourth day, the company was no longer pretending everything was normal. The language had changed. So had the tone. What had started as a family betrayal was now an institutional reckoning. And still, no one had heard my voice. They were beginning to understand that the most dangerous thing I had done wasn't walking away. It was building something they couldn't dismantle without me. As I turned out the lights that night, I thought about how often people confuse control with ownership, how easily they dismiss the ones who quietly hold things together. They believed signing me out would make me irrelevant. Instead, it had revealed exactly how essential I had always been. And tomorrow, the pressure would increase. By the fifth day, denial was no longer an option. It had been replaced by something far more dangerous: desperation disguised as strategy. My sister arrived at headquarters before sunrise, heels clicking sharply against the marble floor as if speed alone could restore authority. The lobby lights were still dim, the security guard barely looking up as she passed. That small detail would have enraged her on any other day. Today, she didn't even notice. Her mind was already racing ahead, assembling half-formed plans, grasping for control that had begun slipping faster than she could track. Inside her office, she dropped her bag and stared at the city below. The glass reflected her image back at her, sharp and tense, a woman who looked powerful but felt anything but. She had spent the night scrolling through legal briefs and executive summaries she barely understood, searching for a sentence that would tell her this was temporary, that it could still be reversed. None of them did. By 8 o'clock, the emergency leadership meeting was underway. The mood had changed completely from the confident post-signing days. No one smiled, no one joked. Phones lay face down on the table, silent but threatening. "We need to act," my sister said, breaking the tension. "Now, not later." The head of legal leaned forward, hands folded carefully. "We need to be precise," he said. "Any move we make right now will be scrutinized." "Then we make the right move," she snapped. "This company can't just stall. We'll lose credibility." "You're already losing it," someone muttered under their breath. She heard it. "What was that?" she demanded. No one answered. Silence filled the room, thick and uncomfortable. My father sat at the end of the table, shoulders slumped slightly, eyes fixed on a spot no one else could see. He hadn't slept. That much was obvious. The confident patriarch he had always been was eroding, replaced by a man confronting the consequences of his own shortcuts. "We should bring her back," he said suddenly. Every head turned. My sister stared at him, disbelief flashing across her face. "Her? You know who I mean," he said quietly. The room froze. "No," she said immediately. "Absolutely not. That would be admitting we made a mistake." He looked at her then, really looked, and something hardened behind his eyes. "We did make a mistake." The words hung there, heavy. Across the city I was at my desk, reviewing nothing urgent, nothing connected. I had deliberately stepped away from the noise. The systems didn't require my attention. They were doing exactly what they were designed to do. Still, I could feel the shift. When people panic, they reach backward, toward what's familiar, toward the person they underestimated. I didn't answer my phone when it rang that morning. I watched it light up, then go dark. The silence was no longer just a boundary, it was leverage. Back at headquarters, my sister stood abruptly, chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is ridiculous," she said. "We're not crawling back to someone who has no stake here anymore." "She has more stake than you realize," my father replied. That was the moment the illusion shattered. She stared at him, stunned. "What is that supposed to mean?" He didn't answer. Because answering meant admitting that he had known, at least on some level, how much of the company's real control had rested with me. It meant acknowledging that signing me out hadn't erased my influence. It had exposed it. The meeting dissolved shortly after, not because decisions had been made, but because no one knew what to do next. By midday, the first real blow landed. A major partner formally suspended collaboration pending governance clarification. The email was polite, professional, devastating. It cited risk exposure, instability, and lack of clear operational authority. It was copied to legal, compliance, and my sister directly. She read it twice, then slammed her laptop shut. "This is your fault," she snapped at my father. "You rushed this." His jaw tightened. "You pushed for it. And you signed," she shot back. The argument escalated quickly, years of unspoken resentment bubbling to the surface. Accusations flew, regrets surfaced. The kind of fight that happens when two people realize they've lost something together and don't know how to face it. I wasn't there to hear it, but I didn't need to be. The fracture had been inevitable. That afternoon, legal delivered another update. Compliance had escalated their review. Not an investigation yet, but closer. Requests for documentation were becoming more detailed, timelines more compressed. "We need cooperation," the lawyer said carefully. "Full transparency." My sister laughed bitterly. "Transparency? After everything she's done?" The lawyer hesitated. "She hasn't done anything." That was the most unsettling part. I spent that afternoon walking through a bookstore, letting the quiet steady me. I picked up a novel I'd been meaning to read for years, flipped through its pages, then set it back down. My thoughts kept circling the same realization. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about what happens when people confuse power with possession. Late in the afternoon, my father finally did what he should have done days ago. He called my old number again. This time, when I answered, his voice was stripped of authority. "We need your help," he said. I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence stretch, not to punish him, but to hear what he would say next. "I shouldn't have done it that way," he added. I didn't realize." "You didn't want to realize," I said calmly. He exhaled shakily. "Please, just talk to us." "I am talking," I replied. "You just don't like what you're hearing." Another pause. Then, quietly, "What do you want?" The question revealed everything. He still thought this was a negotiation. "I don't want anything," I said. "That's the difference." When the call ended, my hands were steady. My heart was calm. The power dynamic had fully reversed, and not because I had demanded it. At headquarters, my sister paced her office, anger giving way to something closer to fear. She scrolled through her messages, searching for allies. Most went unanswered. Those that did respond offered sympathy without solutions. She finally sent me a message. It was short, careful. "We need to talk." I read it once. Then I set the phone down. That evening, a confidential memo circulated internally, outlining potential restructuring scenarios if governance concerns weren't resolved quickly. It was the kind of document that signals serious trouble without declaring it publicly. People who knew how to read between the lines began quietly updating their resumes. My father sat alone again that night, staring at the darkened city outside his office window. He thought of the countless times he had told me to be patient, to wait my turn, to trust him. He wondered when patience had turned into permission. My sister went home early, her confidence shattered. The house she now owned felt cavernous, oppressive. She poured a drink she didn't finish, and sat on the couch scrolling through headlines that hadn't yet named them, but would soon. And I went to bed knowing the fifth day had done what I never could have done by force. It had made them reach for me not out of dominance, not out of obligation, but out of need. They still believed I might save them. They were wrong. Because the truth was simpler and far more final. I wasn't preparing to return. I was preparing to let the structure finish what it had started. The first thing my sister learned that morning was that power doesn't disappear loudly. It freezes. Her phone started vibrating at 6:12, sharp and insistent against the nightstand. She ignored it at first, rolling onto her side, convinced it was another anxious email she could deal with later. But it didn't stop. Calls stacked on top of each other. Notifications layered so fast the screen blurred. By the time she finally grabbed the phone, her heart was already racing. Finance, legal, operations. She answered the first call without speaking. "We have a situation," the voice on the other end said, tight and controlled. "Several operational accounts aren't processing." "What do you mean, aren't processing?" she snapped, sitting upright. "Frozen?" "Not frozen," he replied. "Delayed, conditional." That word again, conditional. By the time she arrived at headquarters, the building felt wrong, too quiet, too still. The usual morning rush had been replaced by small clusters of employees whispering near their desks, eyes flicking up when she passed. Doors that were normally open were closed. Meetings that should have been running were postponed without explanation. She stormed into her office and dropped her bag on the desk. "I want answers, now!" Within minutes, senior leadership crowded into the room. No one sat comfortably. No one met her eyes for long. "The accounts affected are tied to compliance triggers," the head of finance explained. "They require secondary verification before funds can be released." "Verification from whom?" she demanded. There was a pause, too long. "From the governance committee," he said, "and external oversight." Her chest tightened. "Why would they need to verify anything? I signed the transfer. I own the company." "Yes," he said carefully, "but ownership isn't the same as operational clearance." Across the city, I watched the same data appear on my screen. Red flags, amber delays, confirmation requests stacking neatly in the system logs. Everything was behaving exactly as designed. No alarms, no dramatic shutdowns, just friction. Enough to slow momentum, enough to make people uncomfortable. I didn't touch anything. At headquarters, my father arrived an hour later, summoned by urgency he didn't yet understand. He took in the atmosphere the moment he stepped inside, the way people avoided eye contact, the way conversations stopped when he approached. "What's going on?" he asked quietly. My sister launched into an explanation that grew less coherent the longer she spoke. Delays, reviews, overreach, bureaucracy. She blamed compliance. She blamed advisors. She blamed timing. He listened, jaw tight, then turned to legal. "How serious is this?" The lawyer hesitated. "It's not a crisis," he said, "but it could become one if we don't address the underlying concerns." "What concerns?" my father pressed. Governance continuity, the lawyer replied. Concentration of authority, fiduciary safeguards. My father felt a chill run through him. Those words were uncomfortably familiar. Years earlier, I had insisted on those safeguards. I had argued that family businesses collapse not because of markets, but because of unchecked control. He had agreed in theory, then forgotten the details the moment they became inconvenient. Now, those details were back. By mid-morning, the freeze began spreading. Not total, strategic. Certain transactions processed without issue. Others stalled without explanation. Vendors called asking why payments were late. Banks requested clarification on authorization chains. Every answer generated more questions. My sister paced her office like a caged animal. "This is sabotage," she hissed. "She did this." "No," legal said quietly. "This is automated." That made it worse. Across town, I closed my laptop and went for a walk. The day was clear, ordinary. People lined up for coffee. A dog barked somewhere down the block. It was strange how normal everything felt while a company I had once given everything to began quietly suffocating under its own assumptions. I wasn't angry. Anger would have rushed things. This required patience. Back at headquarters, an emergency call came in from the bank. A risk officer requested an immediate discussion regarding exposure reassessment. The language was formal, polite, devastating. My sister listened, her face draining of color. "You're pulling support?" "We're reviewing support," the officer corrected. "Pending clarification." Clarification. Another word that sounded harmless until it wasn't. She hung up and turned on my father. "Call her," she said sharply. "This is out of control." He hesitated. "You said she had no leverage." She glared at him. "Just call her." He didn't. Not yet. Pride and fear twisted together inside him, locking his hands at his sides. By noon, an internal memo circulated. Operations were instructed to pause non-essential expenditures. Human resources canceled onboarding for 2 new hires. Marketing delayed a campaign launch. Small decisions, each one reasonable on its own. Together they sent a clear message. Something was wrong. Employees felt it. Partners felt it. The company felt it. And still no one could point to a single person responsible. In the early afternoon, my sister tried again. This time she left a voicemail, her voice tight, clipped, carefully controlled. "We need to resolve this," she said. "Whatever you think you're proving, it's hurting the company." I listened to the message later and deleted it. What she didn't understand was that the company wasn't being hurt. It was being protected. From instability, from unilateral control, from decisions made in haste and arrogance. By 3 o'clock, legal delivered the update that changed everything. "Compliance has escalated the review," the lawyer said. "If concerns aren't addressed within 24 hours, the matter moves to formal investigation." 24 hours. The room went silent. My father felt his stomach drop. He knew what that meant. Investigations didn't care about family. They didn't negotiate. They exposed. My sister laughed, sharp and brittle. "This is insane. They can't do this." "They can," the lawyer said. "And they will." Across the city, I felt the shift before I saw it. The clock had started. Not because I pressed a button, but because the conditions had been met. Governance breached, safeguards activated, oversight engaged. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop one last time, not to intervene, but to confirm. The countdown had begun. At headquarters, panic replaced anger. My sister snapped orders no one rushed to follow. Advisors spoke in careful tones, distancing themselves. My father sank into a chair, suddenly very old. "Call her," he whispered. Still no one did. They were afraid of hearing my voice more than they were afraid of losing everything. That evening, as the building emptied, my sister stood alone in her office, city lights flickering on below. The glass reflected her back at herself, a woman who had everything on paper and nothing where it mattered. She finally sent one more message. No demands, no accusations, just 4 words. "Please, talk to us." I read it in the quiet of my apartment, the city humming softly outside my window. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt certainty. I replied with nothing. The silence was answer enough. By nightfall, the company was no longer functioning on momentum. It was holding its breath. Every decision deferred, every risk magnified. The systems that had once kept it safe were now holding it still, waiting for accountability that wasn't coming. My father went home early. My sister stayed late, staring at documents she didn't understand, realizing too late that control had never lived in signatures or titles. And I went to bed knowing that the 24 hours ahead would change everything. Not because I would act, but because I already had. The call came just after sunrise, the kind of call that carries weight before a single word is spoken. I was standing in my kitchen, barefoot on cold tile, coffee untouched on the counter, when my secure line lit up. I didn't rush to answer it. I already knew what it would be about. Instead, I watched the city wake through the window, the slow, ordinary rhythm of people who had no idea how quickly power was shifting behind closed doors. When I finally picked up, I didn't say hello. "They've started calling each other," my attorney said. "That stage always comes before the cracks turn into breaks." I closed my eyes briefly. Not in relief, in focus. By mid-morning, the family company was no longer whispering. It was bleeding confidence in plain sight. Department heads were requesting emergency approvals that never came. Legal was fielding inquiries they couldn't fully answer. Finance was stuck in a loop of conditional clearances and escalating reviews. Every process that once flowed smoothly now stalled at invisible checkpoints. No alarms, no explosions, just friction, everywhere. My sister had slept in her office, fueled by caffeine and denial. By the time she stepped into the executive conference room, her makeup was flawless, her suit immaculate, but the cracks were visible to anyone who knew where to look. Her hands trembled when she lifted her tablet. Her voice came out sharper than necessary. "This is sabotage," she said again, louder this time, as if volume could make it true. "Someone is interfering." The room didn't respond the way it used to. No nods, no murmured agreement. Just careful faces and measured silence. The chief compliance officer cleared his throat. "We've traced the triggers. They're not external," she spun on him. "Then explain it." "They're internal safeguards," he said. "Legacy ones." My sister froze. "What do you mean, legacy?" He hesitated, then chose his words with surgical precision. "They were implemented years ago, before the ownership transfer. They're designed to activate when certain authority thresholds are crossed without corresponding approvals." "Whose approvals?" she demanded. Again that pause. "Not yours," he said quietly. Across town, I sat at my desk and listened to the live update through my secure feed. Not audio, data. The system was behaving exactly as it had been built to behave. Calm, impersonal, unmoved by titles or tantrums. My father arrived shortly after, summoned by urgency and fear. He looked smaller than I remembered, his shoulders drawn in, his confidence leaking away with every unanswered question. He took a seat at the head of the table out of habit, then realized too late that the habit no longer fit. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice lower than usual. No one rushed to reassure him. My sister spoke instead, her words tumbling over each other. "It's temporary, just procedural delays. We'll resolve it." My father turned to legal. "Is that true?" The lawyer inhaled slowly. "It depends." "On what?" "On whether the governance issues are addressed." My father's face tightened. "What issues?" The lawyer opened a folder. "Concentration of control, absence of counterbalance, breach of fiduciary continuity." Each phrase landed like a stone. I remembered the meeting years ago when I'd insisted on those exact protections, the way my sister had rolled her eyes, the way my father had waved it off as unnecessary caution. They had signed anyway, more interested in speed than substance. Now speed had abandoned them. By noon, the first partner pulled out. It wasn't dramatic. No press release, no confrontation, Just a polite email citing unresolved governance concerns and risk exposure. A temporary pause in collaboration. Temporary pauses have a way of becoming permanent. My sister slammed her tablet onto the table. Call them back. We did, the head of strategy said. They won't commit until the review clears. Her jaw clenched. Then clear it. We can't, he replied. Not unilaterally. The word echoed in the room. Unilaterally. For the first time, my sister looked at my father not with confidence but with accusation. You said this wouldn't happen. My father didn't answer. He was staring at the documents in front of him, his hands slack at his sides, recognition dawning too late. He had signed away assets and authority without understanding the difference between ownership and control. Across the city, I stood and walked to the window. The sun was higher now, light glinting off glass and steel. Somewhere in that skyline was the building where I'd once worked late into the night, solving problems no one credited me for, building structures no one bothered to understand. They had taken my name off the door. They hadn't taken my architecture. In the early afternoon, the board demanded an emergency session. Not a family discussion, a formal one. My sister paced the hallway outside the boardroom, phone pressed to her ear, leaving voicemails that grew more desperate with each attempt. Advisors who once answered on the first ring now let calls go to voicemail. Consultants sent assistants. Assistants sent emails. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was brittle. The chair opened with careful neutrality. We need clarity. My sister launched into a defense that sounded rehearsed but hollow. She spoke of vision, of leadership, of decisiveness. She avoided specifics. She avoided the words that mattered. When she finished, the chair turned to legal. Can you confirm that the current structure complies with governance requirements? The lawyer hesitated. As it stands, no. My sister's head snapped up. What? The safeguards were designed to prevent unilateral consolidation of power without multi-tier approval, the lawyer continued. Those approvals were not obtained. My father felt the room tilt, but the transfer was legal. It was, the lawyer said. Legality is not the same as sustainability. Silence followed. Heavy. Unforgiving. I received the notification seconds later. The board had initiated an external review. That was the point of no return. Once external oversight enters, control leaves the room. By late afternoon, the press began sniffing around. Not headlines yet. Questions. Carefully worded inquiries about internal stability, leadership transitions, governance reviews. The kind of questions that signal vulnerability without accusing it. My sister tried to project calm. She scheduled a staff meeting, spoke about transparency and resilience. Her voice didn't carry the authority she thought it did. Employees listened politely and left unsettled. My father retreated to his office and closed the door. That was when he finally called me. I let it ring, not because I was cruel, because I was precise. When I answered on the third call, I didn't speak first. Please, he said, his voice breaking through the line. We need to talk. I leaned back in my chair. About what? This chaos, he said. We didn't know. We didn't understand. I almost laughed, almost. You didn't want to understand, I said quietly. There's a difference. He swallowed. Your sister is overwhelmed. She wanted everything, I replied. This is what everything looks like without structure. Can you help? He asked. There it was. Not apology, not accountability, a request. I am helping, I said, just not the way you expected. He was silent. You thought I was broke, I continued, that I had nothing left. You were wrong. His breath caught. What did you do? I prepared, I said simply. I ended the call before he could respond. As evening fell, the company was no longer pretending. The freeze had spread. Not total, but enough to paralyze. Vendors demanded assurance. Banks requested documentation. Regulators scheduled preliminary inquiries. My sister sat alone in her office again, staring at a city that no longer felt like it belonged to her. She opened her laptop and searched for my name, and for the first time, she found what she hadn't expected. Shell entities, advisory boards, strategic partnerships that predated the transfer, quiet agreements that placed real authority outside the structures she had seized. She closed the laptop slowly, dread pooling in her stomach. They hadn't taken everything. They had taken the surface. I stood in my apartment as night settled, the city lights blinking on one by one. My phone buzzed again. A message from my sister this time. Short, uncharacteristically restrained. "We need to fix this." I didn't respond, because by then it was already broken beyond repair. The company was collapsing inward, not from an attack, but from exposure. From the sudden realization that power without understanding is just noise, and the people who had believed I was finished were only beginning to understand how wrong they had been. By the time the sun rose on the second day, the company no longer felt like it was in trouble. It felt like it was being examined under a microscope. Nothing dramatic had happened overnight, no headlines, no sirens. But when my sister walked into headquarters that morning, she could feel it immediately. The air was tighter. Conversations stopped too quickly. People who once hovered now kept a careful distance, as if proximity itself carried risk. She checked her phone before reaching her office. 12 missed calls, 3 from legal, 2 from finance. 1 from a number she didn't recognize, which she already knew meant regulators. Inside her office, she dropped into the chair and stared at the city through the glass. 24 hours earlier, she had believed this was a temporary disruption. A glitch. Something she could overpower with authority. Now she understood something was fundamentally wrong. At 9 sharp, compliance requested her presence. Not a meeting she had called. One she couldn't cancel. The room was small, deliberately so. No long table, no grand chairs. Just 4 people and a screen displaying a list of flagged transactions. "We need clarification," the compliance director said calmly. Several movements initiated after the asset transfer triggered risk indicators. "They're routine," my sister replied quickly. "Expansion costs, vendor consolidation." The director nodded. "Individually, yes. Collectively, they form a pattern." "What pattern?" "Extraction without reinvestment," he said. "That raises fiduciary concerns." My sister leaned forward. "I own the company." "That addresses authority," he replied. "Not obligation." Across town, I watched the same flags light up in sequence. This was the stage I had anticipated but never rushed. When people take everything at once, they reveal their priorities. Systems notice. By late morning, the board reconvened without my sister present. That alone sent a message. My father was invited. He sat stiffly at the table, hands folded, eyes darting from face to face. These were people he had known for years, people who had once deferred to him. Now they spoke in careful, neutral tones that offered no comfort. "The review is expanding," the chair said. "We need to discuss contingency." "Contingency for what?" my father asked. "For leadership instability." The words landed hard. "This is temporary," he insisted. "My daughter is capable." "Capability isn't the issue," the chair replied. "Governance is." My father felt the weight of that word press into his chest. Governance, the thing he had dismissed as paperwork, the thing I had obsessed over, the thing that now held his empire in suspension. By noon, the banks escalated. What had been requests became requirements. What had been courtesy became caution. Lines of credit were reviewed, exposure limits adjusted, conditions attached. My sister tried to reassure herself by calling contacts she believed were loyal. One by one, they responded with variations of the same phrase. "We need to see how this plays out." That phrase had always meant one thing. "You're on your own." I spent the afternoon in meetings of my own, quiet ones, with people who understood what was happening because they had helped build it, advisors who knew the difference between assets and leverage. partners who had trusted me long before my family ever did. "They're panicking," one of them said after reviewing the latest reports. "Yes," I replied, "which means they'll make mistakes." At 3 o'clock, my sister made one. She issued a directive bypassing an internal review process, attempting to force a transaction through manually. The system rejected it, automatically. That rejection triggered a cascade: audit logs flagged, oversight notified, external reviewers alerted. She slammed her fist against her desk, breath coming fast and shallow. "Get legal in here," she snapped. Legal arrived pale. "You can't do that," the lawyer said. "It looks like circumvention." "I don't care what it looks like," she hissed. "I need liquidity." The lawyer hesitated. "If you push this further, it strengthens the case against us." Against us? That word stung. My father arrived moments later, drawn by reports of escalation. He took in the scene, his daughter pacing, legal standing rigid, the atmosphere thick with fear. "Stop," he said quietly. My sister rounded on him. "Stop what?" "This," he gestured helplessly. "All of this." She stared at him, disbelief flashing across her face. "You said this was mine." "It is," he said, "but maybe we need to slow down." She laughed, sharp and brittle. "Slow down? They're tearing us apart." He flinched. "They're not tearing us apart. Something else is." For the first time, the thought crept into his mind, fully formed and terrifying. This wasn't chaos. This was design. Across the city, I received the alert confirming the attempted override. I didn't intervene, I forwarded it, not to regulators, to the board. Within the hour, the board chair requested an emergency call with my father, not my sister. That exclusion spoke louder than any accusation. When my father returned from the call, his face was ashen. "They're considering interim measures," he said. My sister froze. "What kind of measures?" "Temporary reassignment of operational authority," he replied. Her eyes widened. "They can't do that." "They can," he said softly, "and they might." Something inside her cracked then, not fully, but enough. She looked at him not as a co-conspirator, but as someone who had led her into a trap. "You promised me," she whispered. He had no answer. As evening approached, the first article appeared online. Not sensational, not accusatory. Just a measured piece about internal reviews and leadership questions within a prominent family company. The comments were worse: speculation, doubt, questions about succession planning, about competence. Reputation, once fractured, doesn't heal quickly. My sister read every word, her confidence draining with each scroll. She drafted a statement, deleted it, drafted another. Nothing felt right. She finally sent me a message. Longer this time. "We didn't know what you had built. We didn't think it mattered. Please, we need your help." I read it once, then again. And then I closed my phone. Because the truth was, they had known. They just hadn't cared. Late that night, my father sat alone in his study, documents spread across his desk. He reread agreements he had signed years ago, clauses he had skimmed, footnotes he had ignored. The language was clear now in a way it had never been before. Control was conditional, always had been, and those conditions were no longer being met. Across the city, I prepared for the next phase. Not action, revelation. The systems were doing their work. The oversight was tightening. The company was being forced to confront the difference between ownership and stewardship. And my family was learning far too late that taking everything doesn't mean you understand anything. By midnight, my sister stopped sending messages. Not because she had given up, but because she was finally afraid. And fear, unlike arrogance, has a way of telling the truth. The morning everything finally broke, no one announced it. There was no dramatic alert, no urgent email stamped high priority. The collapse didn't arrive like an explosion. It arrived like gravity, pulling every unstable thing downward at once. At 7:43, the first regulator walked into headquarters. She wasn't wearing a power suit or carrying an entourage, just a neutral blazer, a tablet tucked under her arm, and an expression so calm it unsettled everyone who noticed her. She checked in at reception, presented credentials, and asked politely to be escorted to a conference room. Within minutes, 3 more followed. By 8, the building was locked into protocol mode. Employees were instructed to remain at their desks. External calls were rerouted. Internal messaging slowed to a crawl, as approvals were frozen pending review. The kind of review that didn't end quickly. My sister was in her office when the knock came. Not a courtesy knock, a firm one. She opened the door to find legal, compliance, and security standing together. "They're here," legal said quietly. Her throat tightened. "Who?" "You know who." Down the hall, my father stepped out of his office at the same time, drawn by the sudden shift in energy. He watched the group escort my sister toward the main conference room, her spine straight, her face pale but composed. For a brief, irrational moment, he thought she might still talk her way out of this. He was wrong. Across the city, I sat at my desk and watched the access logs update in real time. Oversight engaged. External review confirmed. Temporary authority suspension pending findings. I exhaled slowly. This was the point of no return. In the conference room, the regulators wasted no time. "We're here to conduct a formal inquiry into governance breaches, fiduciary conduct, and potential misrepresentation," the lead investigator said, her tone clinical. "This process requires full cooperation." My sister nodded stiffly. "Of course." The investigator turned to legal. "We'll begin with documentation." Boxes arrived. Digital files were accessed. Audit trails unfolded line by line. Every shortcut, every override attempt, every flagged transaction. Patterns emerged quickly. My sister tried to explain. "I was consolidating operations." The investigator didn't look up. "Without required approvals." "I had authority." "You had ownership," the investigator corrected. "Authority is conditional." That word again. Conditional. My father sat in a separate room waiting. No one had invited him into the inquiry. That exclusion cut deeper than any accusation. He wasn't even considered relevant enough to question. When legal finally approached him, their faces were grim. "They're suspending operational control," the lawyer said. "Effective immediately." My father's breath caught. "Suspending who?" "All executive authority currently assigned to your younger daughter," the lawyer replied. "An interim committee will assume control." The floor seemed to tilt beneath him. "What about me?" he asked. The lawyer hesitated. "Your previous role was advisory. That status is under review." Under review. The phrase felt like a verdict. Inside the conference room, my sister felt the walls closing in. The investigators were no longer asking questions. They were confirming conclusions. "This override attempt," the lead investigator said, tapping the screen, "triggered an escalation clause." My sister's voice cracked. "I was trying to save the company." The investigator finally met her eyes. "From whom?" Silence. Because the answer was obvious. From oversight, from accountability, from limits. At 10:15, the board convened without her, without my father. An interim chair was appointed. External advisors joined the call. The tone was no longer cautious. It was decisive. "We need to stabilize operations," the chair said. "That requires distancing the company from the individuals who triggered this review." Names weren't spoken. They didn't need to be. By late morning, the press had caught wind of it. This time, the articles were sharper. Words like inquiry, suspension, governance failure crept into headlines. My sister read them from her phone in the conference room while regulators continued combing through records. Her confidence drained with every update. At noon, she finally asked the question she'd been avoiding. "Can I call her?" she whispered to Legal. Legal shook his head. "Not now." Across the city, my phone buzzed anyway. A call from my father. I answered this time. His voice was hoarse. "They're taking it all." I leaned back in my chair. "They're reviewing it." "You knew," he said. "You knew this would happen." "I knew it was possible," I replied. That's why I built safeguards. You let us walk into this." "No," I said calmly. "You walked." I stepped aside. He was quiet for a long moment. "She's scared," he said finally. "So was I replied. That ended the conversation. At headquarters, the investigators concluded their initial assessment. "We'll be issuing a formal notice," the lead investigator said. "Until further review, you are prohibited from exercising executive authority." My sister's hands shook. "What does that mean?" "It means," the investigator said evenly, "you no longer control this company." The words hung in the air. Control, gone. Security escorted her out of the conference room, not forcibly, respectfully, but unmistakably. Employees watched from their desks, pretending not to stare. Whispers rippled through the floors. The woman who had claimed everything now had nothing to command. My father saw her in the hallway, eyes glassy, face tight. He reached for her arm instinctively. She pulled away. "This is your fault," she hissed under her breath. He flinched, the accusation landing where guilt already lived. By mid-afternoon, the interim committee issued its first directive. All non-essential projects paused. External communications centralized. A public statement prepared. It didn't mention names. It didn't need to. The company had distanced itself. At 4:30, the banks followed suit. Credit lines suspended pending outcome. Risk exposure reassessed. The structure collapsed inward, not from force but from removal of trust. Across the city, I closed my laptop. It was done, not finished but irreversible. The systems had spoken. The oversight had engaged. The illusion of control had dissolved. I stood and walked to the window, watching traffic move below. Life continuing, indifferent to power struggles and family betrayals. My phone buzzed again. A message from my sister this time. "No accusations, no demands." "I didn't know," it read. "I swear I didn't." I stared at it for a long moment. Then I typed a single reply. "That's the problem." At headquarters, my father packed up his office in silence. He avoided mirrors, avoided eye contact. Every step felt heavier than the last. When he left the building, no one stopped him. No one followed. For the first time in decades, he walked out with no authority behind his name. My sister remained inside longer, sitting in an empty office staring at the city she thought she owned. By nightfall, the company issued its official statement. Calm, measured, reassuring, commitment to transparency, cooperation with regulators, focus on long-term stability. The market responded with caution, not panic. The company would survive, just not under them. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at my desk one last time, reviewing the final updates. Authority suspended. Oversight active. Interim leadership installed. The collapse was complete, not loud, not vengeful, just inevitable. And as the city lights flickered on, I understood something with absolute clarity. They had taken everything that could be signed. I had kept everything that mattered. The silence after collapse is always louder than the chaos that comes before it. On the morning of the third day, the company was still standing, but it no longer belonged to my family in any meaningful way. Authority had been stripped, names removed from decision chains, access downgraded to observation only. My sister's executive badge no longer opened doors. My father's name no longer stopped conversations. They were present, but irrelevant. At 8:15, an official notice arrived in their inboxes at the same time. Neutral language, cold precision, temporary suspension of executive authority, restriction from operational influence, mandatory cooperation with ongoing investigation, no expiration date. My sister read it twice, then a third time, as if the words might change if she stared long enough. They didn't. Her hands trembled as she set the tablet down on the desk she no longer controlled. "This can't be permanent," she said, more to herself than anyone else. Legal didn't respond immediately. That hesitation told her everything. My father sat across from her in the stripped-down meeting room the interim committee had assigned them. No portraits on the walls, no polished wood table, Just a functional space meant for people who no longer mattered enough for comfort. "They're freezing us out," she whispered. My father nodded slowly. "They're protecting themselves. For years you told me I was ready," she snapped, "that I deserved this." "I thought you did," he said quietly. She laughed, sharp and brittle. "You thought, you didn't know." The words landed between them like broken glass. Across the city, I watched the same conversation summarized in legal notes. No audio, no emotion, just timestamps and outcomes. The system didn't care about regret. It only recorded consequence. By mid-morning, the interim committee issued its next directive. An external management firm would assume day-to-day control until the investigation concluded. All strategic decisions required dual approval. Family involvement suspended indefinitely. Indefinitely. That word had weight. My sister stood abruptly. "We need to do something." My father looked up at her, exhausted. "Like what?" "Like fighting back." "With what?" he asked. "We don't have leverage." She opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time since the transfer, she had no answer. At 10:30, she tried to call one of the board members she'd once considered an ally. The call went to voicemail. She left a message, careful and restrained, promising cooperation and stability. No one returned it. The realization settled slowly but completely. They weren't waiting for her to recover. They were waiting for her to disappear. Across town, I attended a meeting of my own. Quiet. Private. The kind of meeting my family never believed mattered. Advisors, partners, oversight liaisons. "The review is proceeding faster than expected," one of them said. "The override attempt accelerated things." "Yes," I replied, "it usually does." "There will be consequences," another added, "beyond removal." "I understand." They studied me carefully, not with suspicion, with respect. "You won't be implicated," the lead advisor said. "Your safeguards are documented. Your distance from the transfer is clear." I nodded. That was the point. By noon, the market reacted again, not with panic, but with restraint. A slight dip, a signal of uncertainty. Analysts began asking questions about succession planning and risk exposure. Questions invite answers, and answers were coming. My sister saw the first analyst report on her phone and felt something inside her finally give way. Not anger, not fear, defeat. "They're blaming me," she said flatly. My father didn't argue. He had stopped trying to protect her from the truth, perhaps because he finally saw his own reflection in it. "They're blaming instability," he said, "and we represent it." She turned on him. "You signed everything." "And you demanded it," he replied. The room went quiet. In that silence, something irreparable fractured between them. Not trust. That had been gone for years. But illusion. They could no longer pretend they were victims of circumstance. They were authors of it. In the early afternoon, my sister did something she hadn't done in years. She walked, out of the building, past the security desk that no longer acknowledged her, into the street where no one recognized her, no one cared who she was. She stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, the city rushing around her, and realized she had nowhere to go that mattered. Her phone buzzed. A message from my father. "Come back, we need to talk." She ignored it. Across the city, I received another update. The regulators had identified additional discrepancies, not criminal, but careless, enough to justify extended oversight. This would not resolve quickly. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, not in satisfaction but in release. The weight I'd carried for years loosened its grip. At 4 o'clock, the interim committee released an internal memo. Calm, reassuring, transparent, commitment to ethical governance, respect for oversight, clear separation from prior leadership decisions. The language was deliberate. They were rewriting the story, and my family was no longer in it. My father read the memo alone in his study that evening, glasses slipping down his nose, the words blurring together. He remembered another memo, years ago, one I had written and begged him to read. He had skimmed it, dismissed it. Overcautious, he had said. Now caution was all that remained. He picked up the phone and dialed my number. This time, when I answered, he didn't speak immediately. I should have listened to you, he said finally. I didn't respond. I thought strength meant decisiveness, he continued. I thought control meant ownership. And now, I asked quietly, and now I see I was wrong. I let the silence stretch, not to punish him, to let the truth settle. I don't want to lose my family, he said, voice cracking. You already did, I replied, when you chose convenience over integrity. He exhaled shakily. Is there any way back? I considered the question carefully, not emotionally, logically. There's no way back, I said. Only forward, separately. He didn't argue. That night, my sister sat in her apartment, lights off, scrolling through news articles that no longer mentioned her name. She reread messages she had sent me, each one unanswered. For the first time, she wondered not how to regain power, but who she was without it. Across the city, I stood on my balcony and watched the skyline glow against the dark. The company would survive. It would adapt. It always had. Just not under the people who believed they owned it by birthright. The collapse was complete. What came next would not be revenge. It would be reckoning. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting to see what my family would do. I was deciding what I would. The day after authority was stripped, my father woke to a house that no longer felt like his. The walls were the same. The furniture hadn't moved. But something essential was missing. Something he had carried for so long he mistook it for permanence. Control had been his language. Without it, the silence pressed in on him from every corner. He sat at the kitchen table long after his coffee went cold, staring at his phone. No missed calls, no urgent emails, no advisors waiting for direction. For the first time in decades, the world wasn't asking him for anything. Across town, my sister woke in her apartment with a pounding headache and a sense of vertigo she couldn't shake. The curtains were still drawn from the night before. Her phone lay face down on the floor where she'd dropped it. She didn't reach for it right away. When she finally did, the screen confirmed what she already knew. No updates, no reversals, no rescue. The suspension stood. At headquarters, the interim management moved efficiently, almost gently, like surgeons operating on a patient who could survive only if the infection was fully removed. Meetings were shorter, decisions were documented. Every action passed through oversight. The company felt steadier already. That was the cruelest part. It was functioning better without them. By mid-morning, my father received the official letter by courier. Thick paper, formal language, no accusations, just boundaries. He was barred from representing the company in any capacity. Any attempt to intervene would be documented. Any attempt to influence would be escalated. He read it twice, then folded it carefully and set it aside like something fragile. Years ago, he would have laughed at such a letter, dismissed it as theater. Now it read like a verdict. Across the city, I was in a quiet meeting room reviewing long-term plans with people who had never once questioned my competence. The contrast wasn't lost on me. We're entering the stabilization phase, one of them said. Once oversight is satisfied, the company will need a permanent leadership structure. I nodded. With accountability built in. Of course, he replied. That's non-negotiable now. I almost smiled. At noon, my sister finally called my father. He answered on the second ring. They're cutting me out, she said without preamble. He closed his eyes. I know. They won't even let me consult, she continued, anger rising. I built this with you. You inherited it, he corrected softly. And you underestimated it. She went silent. I tried to protect you, he added. I thought giving you everything would keep you safe. Safe from what? She snapped. From being me, he said. That stopped her. Across town, I received a message from one of the oversight liaisons. The investigation was moving toward its final assessment. Findings would be released internally within days. No criminal charges, no scandals, just confirmation of what everyone already knew. That the collapse had been avoidable. That arrogance had done what markets never could. In the afternoon, my sister did something unexpected. She went back to the building. Security stopped her at the entrance. "I just want my things," she said, her voice flat. They checked their list. After a moment, they nodded and escorted her upstairs. She walked through hallways she had once ruled, now just another person passing through. Desks hummed with quiet efficiency. People glanced up, then back down. No glares, no sympathy, indifference. She gathered personal items from her office slowly. A framed photo of her and my father from years ago. A plaque with her name and title engraved in metal. She hesitated over the plaque, then left it behind. It no longer meant anything. My father, meanwhile, drove without destination for hours. Past neighborhoods he no longer recognized. Past offices that no longer welcomed him. He replayed moments he had dismissed, warnings he had ignored. My voice, calm and persistent, echoed in his mind. Safeguards matter. Structure matters. Power without balance collapses. He had heard me. He just hadn't listened. As evening fell, he finally pulled over and called me again. This time, I answered immediately. "I'm not calling about the company," he said quickly. "I know that's gone." I waited. "I'm calling about us," he continued, "about what's left." I leaned against my desk, looking out at the city lights. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether you're ready to stop defending what you did," I said, "and start understanding it." He swallowed. "I failed you." The words landed differently than any apology before them, not because they were perfect, but because they were unguarded. "I made you invisible," he continued. "I convinced myself it was practicality, it was favoritism." I didn't interrupt. "And when your sister demanded everything, I chose speed over wisdom," he said. "I chose her noise over your silence." My chest tightened, but I kept my voice steady. Silence wasn't absence, it was preparation. "I see that now," he whispered. Across town, my sister sat alone on her couch, the apartment too quiet, too empty. She scrolled through old photos, moments when power had felt like identity. She stopped at one image of the three of us years ago. She looked happy in it. So did I. She set the phone down and stared at the wall, the first genuine thought breaking through the fog. If she hadn't taken everything, would any of this have happened? The answer terrified her. That night, the board finalized its internal report. Clear, methodical, unemotional. The collapse had not been caused by malice, but by concentration of unchecked authority. The safeguards had worked. The company would recover. The family would not be part of that recovery. I received the report shortly before midnight. I read it once, then closed the file. There was nothing left to prove. My father sat at his kitchen table again, the house still quiet, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt earned. He finally understood that the price of control is often the loss of connection, and that some losses cannot be reversed. My sister lay awake, staring at the ceiling, no longer plotting her return. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about power. She was thinking about what she had traded for it. Across the city, I turned off my lights and stood by the window, watching the city breathe. I didn't feel triumph. I felt resolution. The collapse had done what confrontation never could. It had told the truth. And the truth, once revealed, doesn't need to shout. It just waits for you to catch up. The first morning after everything settled, I woke up without checking my phone. That alone told me how far I'd come. For years, my days had started with alerts, messages, silent calculations about what problem I'd need to absorb before anyone else noticed it existed. Power used to feel like vigilance, like being on guard at all times. Now the quiet felt earned, not dangerous. Sunlight spilled through the windows of my apartment, soft and unhurried. The city moved below me, indifferent to family empires and corporate collapses. That was the most grounding truth of all. The world keeps going, whether you cling to control or finally let it go. I brewed coffee and stood by the window, watching people cross the street with purpose that had nothing to do with me. Somewhere in those buildings, the company was stabilizing under interim leadership. Processes were being rebuilt, trust was being renegotiated, and my family was no longer part of that equation. The final report arrived mid-morning. No accusations, no dramatic language, just conclusions. The asset transfer had been legal but reckless. The concentration of authority had violated governance safeguards. Oversight had functioned as designed. Corrective measures were justified and complete. I closed the document and archived it. That chapter of my life was officially finished. Later that afternoon, my father requested one last meeting. Not at an office, not through lawyers. At a quiet cafe near the river, a place we used to go when I was younger, before business consumed everything. I agreed. He arrived early, standing when he saw me, unsure whether to hug me or keep his distance. He chose distance. It was the right choice. "Thank you for coming," he said. I nodded and sat across from him. "Say what you need to say." He looked older, not frail, but stripped of the armor he'd worn for decades. Without authority, he was just a man facing the consequences of his choices. "I won't defend what I did," he began, "or what I allowed." I listened without interrupting. "I confused peace with silence," he continued. "I thought as long as there was no conflict, everything was fine. I ignored the cost." I stirred my coffee slowly. "And now?" "And now I know silence can be preparation," he said quietly, "and noise can be destruction." I met his eyes for the first time. Understanding that doesn't undo what happened. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking for restoration. I'm asking for acknowledgement." I considered that, not emotionally, honestly. "You acknowledged it," I said. "That's as far as this goes." Relief flickered across his face, mixed with sadness. He nodded, accepting the boundary without protest. We talked a little longer. About nothing important. The weather, the river, old memories that no longer hurt, just existed. When we stood to leave, he hesitated. "Your sister. She's struggling." "I know," I said. "Will you ever speak to her again?" I didn't answer immediately. The truth deserved precision. "Not while she believes power entitles her to people," I said. He nodded again. There was nothing left to argue. That evening my sister sent me one final message. No apologies, no demands, just a statement. "I'm starting over." I stared at the words for a long time. Then I replied, "So am I." And that was it. No reconciliation montage, no dramatic forgiveness. Just separation, clean and final. The weeks that followed were quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar at first. I was invited to consult on the company's long-term restructuring, but I declined formal involvement. My work had always lived behind the scenes. I preferred it there. Instead, I focused on building something new. Not an empire, not a legacy defined by control, a structure defined by clarity. I started advising firms on governance design, on the kind of safeguards people only appreciate after everything goes wrong. I spoke about balance, about accountability, about how silence can be a strategy and restraint can be power. People listened, not because of my name, because of what I understood. Sometimes, late at night, I thought about the moment my sister believed she had taken everything from me. How convinced she was that ownership meant victory. How certain my father was that speed mattered more than structure. They never saw the architecture beneath their feet. That was the lesson. You can take titles. You can seize assets. You can rewrite paperwork. But if you don't understand where real control lives, you're only borrowing power on borrowed time. And borrowed power always comes due. Now, when I wake up, I don't brace for impact. I don't wait for permission. I don't measure my worth against someone else's approval. I move forward with intention, because silence didn't make me weak. It made me ready. If you've stayed with this story until the end, maybe it's because something in it felt familiar. Maybe you've been underestimated, overlooked, quietly erased by people who assumed your silence meant surrender. It doesn't. Sometimes silence is where the real work happens. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your perspective in the comments. Let me know where you're listening from and what part of this journey stayed with you the most. And if you want more stories about quiet strength, strategic patience, and the kind of justice that unfolds without shouting, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'll be right here, telling the stories that remind us all that losing everything isn't the end. Sometimes it's the moment everything finally begins.